We'll just let a few more people trickle in here before we get going, guys, okay? You can only do that if you're sharing, Eric.
I know, I wish I could. It would be nice to have company up here.
Yeah. Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Thursday evening virtual Winemaker Roundtable. My name is David Amadea. I'm the president, and I'll be moderating today's tasting. Thank you all for joining us. Hoping everyone out there is remaining healthy and dealing with all the circumstances well. A couple of housekeeping items real quickly before we get going. You'll notice at the bottom of Zoom, there is a Q&A function. So if you have any question for our production team during the tasting at any time, please weigh in your questions there. The chat function, that's a little bit more for casual conversation, comments. Let us know where you're at. Let us know what you're drinking. We have somebody monitoring the chat function as well, so feel free to check in there at any time. So I'm really excited about this evening's lineup. I think we have 4 great wines and 4 really exciting wines to try. 4 wines from 4 different vintages sequentially, 2015, 16, 17, and 18. 2 wines produced by Eric and 2 wines produced by John. So we have good symmetry with the wines today. And the wines in question are our 2020 spring ATP release, so our advanced tasting program. These wines went out to club members recently, so many of you probably already have these wines. If not, please feel free to become an ATP member and get these wines in the future because they're some of the most interesting and exciting wines we make at Ridge. So the lineup today in tasting order, for those of you tasting along, the first one will be the 2016 Mazzoni Home Ranch. The second wine will be the Rockpile Zinfandel, the 2018. The third wine will be the 2017 Syrah Grenache Mataro, the SGM. And our fourth and final wine will be the 2015 Lytton Estates Syrah. So our panel today, let me introduce everyone. Up in the upper left-hand corner, on my screen at least, is Eric Bauer. Eric's our winemaker at Montebello and our chief operating officer of the Montebello Winery. Eric's been with Ridge for 26 years, and we appreciate Eric joining us today. And then in the upper right-hand corner is David Gates. David Gates is our Senior VP of Vineyard Operations, has been with Ridge for 31 years and is in charge of all of our vineyards, both our estate vineyards and our outside growers. David, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time today.
Thanks, David.
And third is John Olney in the bottom left-hand corner there. John's been with Ridge for 24 years. He's our Lytton Springs winemaker and chief operating officer of our Lytton Springs winery. So John, thanks a lot for joining us as well. And I think we can kick it off. The first wine is the Mazzoni Home Ranch. It's one of my favorite wines. It's a great blend, all old vines from Alexander Valley, a wine we've been making for some time. So Eric, I know this is a wine you've been working with for a long time. What are your thoughts on the wine, the vineyard, the vintage?
Oh, well, I love everything about the place. I mean, that's why we've been working with it now for over, 24 years. It started in '96, and so this is the 2016 vintage, which was a really good year for those old vines, being drought year. These are all head pruned, dry farmed. I mean, there's no irrigation in the vineyard, so the vines really had to make do with getting whatever water they could get out of the ground to get through the growing season and give us a small crop. This year, we actually were able to make 57 barrels. So even though they were under a lot of stress, they were able to still put out a sizable crop for us to work with and ferment carefully. What I love about this vineyard is the mix. It's just got such a nice kind of group of parcels of vines from the 19th century, some that are heavy in the mix of Zinfandel with some Carignan. Others are more dominant Carignan with a little bit of Zinfandel. Got some white grapes in there, interspersed, a little bit of Petite Syrah. We've picked those blocks out separately as each section ripens. We'll bring it down to Montebello, run it through the destemmer, crush it into small fermenters, let the natural yeast carry out the fermentation. 16 was a year where the tannins were actually on the kind of aggressive side. So we backed off a bit on pump overs to really keep the wine elegant and harmonious and balanced. We pressed early and then did our normal blind tasting to assemble. So picking the very best of the different parcels to assemble. So this year it's actually got a fair amount of Carignan in it. 59 Zin, and then 36 Carignan, and then 5% Petite Syrah. So a little bit of Petite Syrah to give it some structure, but it all came in through the co-fermentation. But with that much Carignan, it's definitely a more of an elegant Mazzoni. And with bright acid, the nice cherry fruit, kind of stone fruit aroma and taste. And then we barreled it down, aged it in American oak, and that just gave it enough and kind of enhancement of spice and some really beautiful flavors that come from the barrel that really has good synergy with the old vine fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, this has always been one of my favorites. I love the fact that the percentage of Carignan is so high in this wine, and the weight of the wine is different from so many of the other old vine Zin blends we work with. It's a little bit lighter in weight, little higher in acidity. It's to me, it's just a great food wine. It's a great wine to drink on its own. It's a great summer red too, and a wine that ages beautifully too. I mean, we've seen over time.
That was really kind of at the heart of the criteria of really keeping this vineyard going for so long. Is that, you know, when we look at any vineyard that we're working with, it's got to be able to produce consistent quality year after year, giving us the ability to make a wine that is, you know, really of place. And because the ground there is really of interesting soil and rock, it's very similar to what we have at Geisable with an alluvial kind of mix. There's some distinct minerality that comes through in the translation in the grapes to the wine. And because it was able to give us this consistent quality over all these years, we've been able to just stay with it. And it
David,
is one of those, yeah.
I'm sorry about that, Eric. Stepped on you. I apologize.
David, that's all right.
I know this is a vineyard you've been working with for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about the history and the family who owns it now and the vineyard itself?
Yes. So the vineyard itself was the oldest vines date from the turn of last century, so 1898 or so. And shortly after that, the Mazzoni family bought it. And Giuseppe Mazzoni was the first winemaker for Italian Swiss colony, which at one point before, maybe 1905, 1906, it was one of the 5 biggest wineries in California. They actually had a 100,000 gallon, or a million, I don't know, they had a big enough tank that they set into the hillside that they had a big ballroom, a big ball there, and with a ballroom dancing and everything before they filled it with wine. Must have been a million cases or a million gallons. Pretty amazing. So he was the winemaker there for quite a few years, and then started his own winery, Mazzoni Winery, and ran that into Prohibition, and never came out of Prohibition. The winery itself remains, and it was purchased in the 1980s by the old Chanti family, who have been they have a lot of property in San Francisco, but wanted a place. They were from Italy, Flora and Nicole Chanti, and they decided to buy this place, and they kept the old vines, and they planted a few younger blocks of Zinfandel and Carignan. And this Mazzoni home ranch comes predominantly from the older blocks. Sometimes a little bit of young Zin on the hillside, young now that's 25 years old, sneaks into the blend. But I don't think it made it in 16. I'm not sure.
No, we
might have.
Yeah, we had enough yield from the older vines that it's basically 100% full vine.
And both Nick and Flora have passed, and now the son Paolo Chanti has the property now, along with his brothers and sister.
So we're getting a lot of good questions. I'm going to start throwing some at the panel here. So what is it about Carignan that we really like, and what does it that bring to the blend? So maybe Eric, you can weigh in on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, because we rely on it also for Geyserville. I mean, what's so magical about the Carignan that comes from these two vineyards, Geyserville and Mazzoni, is that it's all 100-year-old, and that's really pretty special for what you can get from the fruit. It makes these beautifully dark, opaque wines with so much acidity, really full body, but not heavy. So there's really good acid to go with that really good flush density. And so when it's blended with the Zin, it just adds body and balance. It kind of surrounds the tannins better. It just makes the Zin so much more exotic and wild and delicious.
Yeah.
So especially when it's co-fermented, like it is at Mazzoni, you know, so heavily interplanted among all the different blocks, and you just see the effect in the fermenter as everything is bubbling away and extracting. You just come out of the tank with this really dark, rich, really wonderful wine.
Yeah, I mean, I would chime. Oh, I was just going to add. I think Carignan is really an ideal warm weather grape because it really maintains its acidity. And you know, a lot of people may not realize it, but if you've had Old Vine's Zinfandel, you've probably been drinking Carignan for longer than you realize, because it's always been sort of baked into to your classic field blend.
So another question for you, John, that's come up. It's about the oak regime, and people are wondering about how much new oak we use with our Zinfandel, and how do we determine that, and does it vary from one of our Zins to the next?
Yeah, absolutely. It does vary from one Zin to the next, and certainly from wine to wine. If you sort of look at the entire spectrum, as a general rule, are wines that have the most structure, that have the most color, the most phenolics, such as Montebello, even our Petite Syrah. Those tend to be wines that can absorb more new oak flavor without being overwhelmed with them. When you get to Zinfandel, you know, then things really get to be much more variable, and there's a lot of things, the factors that go into that. If you have a Zinfandel where there's a large proportion Petite Syrah in the field blend, maybe you're going to use a little bit more oak. And then vintage to vintage, you know, in vintages where maybe the fruit's a little prettier, a little softer, you're going to use, you know, more in the 15% new oak. If you have a more robust year, it might go up to 20 or 25.
Okay. So it's not necessarily a set formula. There is some vintage to vintage variation in terms of, with Zinfandel in particular, the oak regime.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we adapt here. And every quarter, as we're racking to clarify the wine, we taste, and we from there can decide what's the oak balance. Is it integrating? Is the oak becoming a little too strong? And if it is, we'll send the wine back to older barrels for the rest of its barrel aging before bottling, so it can really incorporate it. Because we don't want the oak to be too heavy. You know, it's nice. It really should play a secondary role in the wine.
So Eric, another term you used early on in describing the wine was a pump over, and somebody was asking exactly what is a pump over? Yeah.
Well, we hook up a hose to the bottom valve of the tank and let it flow to a tub, and then from there pump it with usually an air pump that can pump and move good volume over the tank, and we'll have an irrigator attached to the side of the tank that can be propelled to fan the juice over the skin. So it's basically just moving juice from bottom of tank to top and then gently placing it over the skin. It's a more, well, very, very gentle way to extract color and tannin, and helps with, you know, bringing oxygen to the juice as it's fermenting, because it is such a reductive process that the yeast will really scavenge and use up all the oxygen. And if you don't feed it more oxygen, the yeast will start to create reductive compounds. And especially with Carignan, we always have, for some reason, even in old vine Carignan, there's always a bit of kind of a matchstick reductiveness that can develop in the fermenter. So the more you pump it over, the more oxygen you get to the juice, you can really keep it kind of clean and fresh and focused. And it really helps keep the yeast happy, so you can get to the finish line and press off dry.
So David, one last question on Mazzoni. I mean, this is almost purely, except for the young vines, which are separate, an old vine vineyard. So we're really able to taste the character of old vines and when we make this wine. What for you when you're tasting a strictly old vine wine like Mazzoni? How does that differ from a young vine vineyard? What are you looking for in terms of the taste profile?
So there's typically more depth and complexity in older vines. So part of that's just the way the fruit matures. You can pick it fully mature at a little bit lower sugar levels. It's also partly because the most old vineyards, pre-prohibition vineyards especially, are mixed, as we were talking. So that adds, that doesn't give it just all Zinfandel fruit, or it adds more complexity, more savoriness. I'd say they're more savory rather than sweet on the tannin side. Young Zin is a very pretty wine. It'd be very expressive, and older wines made from older grapes, they're not always that expressive when they're young, and if they are, they're just more complex. That would be, and then there's usually more depth to their tannins. Not necessarily more tannin, but just more complexity again on the finish.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thanks, David. So, John, why don't we move to the second wine, which is the Rockpile. This is a new area that we've begun working with, a newer wine for us. It's sort of an exciting new region, and we're certainly excited to work with it. It's labeled Rockpile, but it actually comes from a specific vineyard site. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this wine.
Sure. So so Rockpile, of course, refers to the actual appellation, and if you know sort of the Dry Creek appellation, which is was established a much longer time ago within Sonoma County. Dry Creek stretches out northwesterly from the town of Healdsburg throughout the Dry Creek Valley, and more recently in 2002, a group of growers from up in the hills beyond to the north of Dry Creek felt that their vineyards really had some special growing conditions that merited separate AVA. So that's where Rockpile originated. And it's one of the unique things about Rockpile, and in fact, it's one of the few appellations in the US which is defined by the elevation. In other words, in order to be in the Rockpile appellation, you have to be at a minimum of 800 feet. And it's actually a beautiful place, overlooks Lake Sonoma. What's unique, I think, is that being up at that elevation, they get a lot more sun, and they get a lot more morning sun. Down in the valley of Dry Creek, we can have heavy fog that lasts almost to 11 o'clock in the morning, whereas they're absorbing a lot of sunshine before the temperatures get too hot. This is a wine that, as David mentioned, we just started using it. Just started making, in 2017, and so we're still getting to know the vineyard. The vineyard's made up of a number of different parcels, so it's not interplanted, but there is a block of Petite Syrah, which in 2018 actually makes up about 12% of the blend. And I really find there's just that sort of quintessential kind of raspberry fruit that you get immediately from Zinfandel. But then I think what stands out about most wines coming out of Rockpile, especially from Zinfandel, which is most of them, is there's this extra layer, this extra intensity to the wine that you sometimes see in things which are grown up in the hills. And for me, that's kind of what makes Rockpile really stand out.
Yeah, it's a real sexy wine, honestly. I mean, it's very broad on the palate and very rich and very giving, not a lot of tannins on the palate, but it's still super fresh. You know, it's not lousy at all. So that's a really neat thing in a wine where it can give you all that richness and sexiness without, you know, getting overblown. And I think it really walks that line, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So David, I mean, you've worked with a lot of appellations with Zinfandel throughout California, particularly up there in northern Sonoma County. For you, what makes Rockpile such a interesting region to work with, particularly with Zinfandel?
Well, the neat part about it is there aren't really any old vines up here. The oldest vines are maybe 20 years old. So that has, and a lot of them, a lot of the Zinfandel that's planted here is one clone selection, which is St. Peter's Church, which is a beautiful Zin selection from a church in the middle of Cloverdale, which is, you know, on the other side of the hills down below the Rockpile AVA. That is a really nice selection of Zinfandel, and it shows in the wines, I think. The other thing that I like about it is the soils are very different. They're kind of similar to what we have at Lytton West up on the hills, and that make up the, say, our East Bench bottling, but they're older and they're more weathered, and they sit up a little bit higher too. And that's the other thing, is the elevation. There's a reason why they chose 800 feet as the elevation cutoff for the ABA, and that's above that inversion layer. So much like we talk all the time about the inversion layer at Montebello and how important it is to have for Cabernet to get ripe to be above that. It's the same thing there. It makes a difference, so that it's a little bit warmer at night, so the vines are respiring and getting ripe. Actually, the tannins are ripening at night more than down in the valley floor, where it can get very cold in the night and hotter in the day. And that helps so that you can get the grapes in maybe at a little bit less stress on them, and you can develop those rich, what you said, the sexy aromas, the grapes, that really velvety flavor.
Yeah. And what's the trick to prevent this wine from Rockpile, from the region, from getting too ripe?
Pick it early.
Yeah, pretty simple, huh? Yeah. Just get in there, huh?
Vigilance about picking, yeah.
And then, John, somebody asked this: why did it take us so long to get on the Rockpile bandwagon?
Well, you know, if you think about it, I mean, it's, you know, like I said, the appellation when we started in 2002, and you know, I don't know what the current count is, but there's only about 14, 15 vineyards up there. So it's still something that's being, you know, it's evolving, and you know, there haven't been that many options, but you know, we think we found a good one.
We kind of lucked into this one, isn't it? I think our CEO, Mark Vernon's doctor, owns this, or something. I mean, it was kind of a fortunate deal that we got access to.
It was a connection. So
yeah.
But also, I mean,
I'm sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Dry Creek Valley is really the place for Zin. I mean, that's why, I mean, we haven't really ventured out to too many other appellations, because we really look at the finest Zinfandels coming from Lytton and Geiseville, you know, in that really narrow region that we have our two estates at. But it is fun. I mean, I love Rockpile. I mean, it's a true like mountain site, and has, again, that exotic soil that we see at Lytton West, and it makes a beautiful wine. So it is actually a really exciting wine to have in the portfolio.
And somebody was asking John about the Petite Syrah in it, and that's sort of gone up a little bit in the second vintage. And, you know, what elements does it bring to the wine? Does it bring an earthiness to the wine?
I think it does. It brings, you know, for me, it brings, I mean, it helps to sort of solidify the color of the wine, but more so than bringing structure, it does, but more so than doing that like it does, for example, in the Lytton Springs or the Geyserville. I think it really contributes both to the aroma and the flavors. It gives it a little bit of a darker side. It gives it things that move over towards, you know, sort of coffee, bean, tobacco, you know, that caramely, that, you know, in age kind of effect, and, you know, really adds complexity to it.
So Eric, if somebody had a question about ageability in terms of how do we determine when we write our back labels, you know, what is the sort of target ageability for a wine, particularly Zinfandel? And do you think that that target level has changed over the years, or has that been pretty consistent in terms of how we made that determination over the years?
You know, I mean, John and I have been here working with Paul a very long time, so we have this long ability, you know, experience of tasting and seeing our youngest vintages and how those have aged out, and same with tasting a lot of the wines that Paul was directly making and how those have aged. I mean, I don't think we get too carried away with our estimates. I mean, of course, they can always go well beyond what we estimate, but I think it comes down to our personal preference of like where we like to drink Zinfandel. You know, kind of when they hit that plateau, you know, they take some time to get there, but then once they're there, they're in that sweet spot of drinking really well. I mean, I've experienced tasting, you know, Geiseville from the 60s, from the 70s, 80s, and they can still drink extremely well even today. It's just hit and miss depending on the vintage, the growing season, the intensity of the wine when it was assembled and put to bottle. So we try to really give our best estimate, but it can sometimes be conservative. But, you know, I do like, you know, the ability to see the wines age out and, you know, try to put my best estimate on the label.
So obviously, you know, when we've been working with a vineyard like Geyserville for more than 50 years, estimating its ageability is much easier for us at this point. Now with Rockpile, we have 2 whole vintages underneath our belt. Estimating ageability there, John, is a little more difficult, right?
Right. No, absolutely. No, there's no question about it. I mean, we don't have the long history to really look at. But you know, I would say in general, I think that we like to err on being a little more conservative. Obviously, how long a wine ages and how it appeals to you when it ages is you know, is an individual preference. But I think it's true, you know, like Eric said, I think that, you know, you can get a feel for where you think a wine can sort of turn that corner, and, you know, that primary fruit sort of starts coming down and it really changes into something else. And then it's just a question of estimating about how long you think it'll be there.
So John, Rockpile is not a huge vineyard. I mean, it's a smaller plot. So how many different lots came in separately? How did you put the wine together? And for those lots that didn't make it into Rockpile, where do those lots go?
So we have, as I mentioned, there's one Petite Syrah block, which ripens a lot more slowly than the Zin. So it always comes in last. So while it's ripening, there's about 5 or 6, it depends on how we pick it, different blocks that all have, because it's up on a hillside, have different, you know, aspects and exposition. So, you know, there's one block that tends to get ripe first. It comes in, and then the others follow fairly quickly within a week to 10 days. You know, and then it's really a question of evaluating them like we do with all of our wines. You know, we're going to ferment each one of those parcels separately, let it go through malolactic, and then, you know, now that it's really become wine, you know, taste those blind, choose the ones that we think are really the most intense, are going to make the best wine. And then if there are wines left over, it goes into 3 valleys.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's an important point, where only the best lots go into the Rockpile, and if they're not, they don't make the grade, then we have a second wine to declassify into, and that's an important principle for all of our winemaking at Ridge.
It's a crucial point, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, having that ability to have the second wine, so you can focus your best lots for the main.
Yeah. So, I mean, a general question, I think that's really important for existing ATP members and those that are considering it. You know, how do we decide when to release a wine to the club program? Now, David Gates, maybe, I mean, you've said in a lot of these tastings, you know, when we're setting the release schedule for ATP, how do we do it?
we sit around and taste the wines. It's
Yeah.
a really hard job, but
Yeah.
no, but we're lucky that we have a pretty good bank of ATP wines, and some of them like Mazzoni, we know that it tastes better when it's got an extra 2 or so years of bottle age on it, and so we always hold it back. And likewise, the fourth wine in this tasting tonight, the Syrah, that always is better if it has a little bit more bottle age on it. So by holding on to those wines a little bit, we're able to release them, and we think that they're just starting to reopen up. Now, a wine like Rockpile, it's gorgeous right now, and it'll continue to be gorgeous for the next 5, 6, 8 years, whatever. And Zinfandel can do that, and it's good. But trying to think of another one, the Buchignani Carignan. That's another one that is gorgeous when it's freshly bottled, and it's really good when it's like 5 or 8 years old too. So, but we can release it when it's young because it does taste so good. So that's how we do it. We taste through them, and then we kind of line them up and try to make the wines that are a little more stout, have a little more tannin, like Petite Syrah goes in the winter time, or if it's a really big Zin, maybe a little higher alcohol. That goes in the winter time. And the Carignan, of course, is a bistro wine, so that's in the summer. So that's kind of how we make it work.
There's a little method to the madness there, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So, David, one more question for you before we move on to the Rhone wines. Why Mataro, not Mourvedre? Why do we utilize that name for that grape?
We're a little chauvinistic here at Ridge. When Mataro or Mourvedre, or the correct name for it is Monastral. When it came to California before Prohibition, it came as Mataro or Mataro. And so the old timers, that's what it was known at. If you look in some of the earliest publications, that's how it was relayed to. And since we have had the privilege over the years of working with some old vineyards of Mataro, that's what we choose to call it. The Mourvedre thing that came in after when it started to kind of take over some of the southern Rhone plantings after Phylloxera had wiped out the vines, and really kind of pushed by Bandol and Tempier. They really championed Mourvedre or Mataro, but it's an old variety because if you go look for the synonyms to it, there are a lot of them, probably 25 or 30. So but yeah, we all should be calling it Monastral. That's its official name.
Yeah.
But we use Mataro because that was really the original name when it came to California. So in sort of California history, that's where it got its start as Mataro. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So good. Let's move to the third wine. Speaking of the Rhone, this is a Southern Rhone inspired wine, our SGM, our Syrah Grenache Mataro. So John, you want to tell us a little bit about this wine and where it comes from?
Yeah, sure. So it comes from Lytton West, from a Lytton Springs vineyard, the western side of the vineyard. Ridge purchased that part of the vineyard in 1995, and when we bought the vineyard, there were vines on site, and one of them was a really beautiful block of pure Syrah, which is the last wine we're going to taste. And I think we were immediately impressed by the Syrah, and that is what sort of inspired us to look into the possibility of more Rhone varietals being planted at Lytton West. So we started planting some Syrah, but we also planted some Grenache and some Mataro, and decided that the Syrah itself really made a wine that embodied that sort of Northern Rhone sort of spirit, but that down in the other parts of the vineyard, we could make something that was most appealing as a Southern Rhone blend. So I think it was 2014 was our first vintage. We started doing that, the combination of the three. And obviously here, unlike with our field blended Zinfandels, these are separate varieties. They ripen very differently, you know, and David can offer some insight on that. So you really have to bring these in separately, evaluate them, and then make the blend, which is one of the reasons that the percentages will vary year to year. But I think, you know, in terms of like just the comparison between a Southern Rhone wine and a Northern Rhone wine, I think it's quite accurate. With the Syrah, Grenache, Mataro, to me, you know, the nose, there's that floralness that for me is a little more like rose petal, which I think is the Grenache coming out. And then on the palate, a little, I think a little broader, doesn't have the you know, that sort of dark inkiness that you get from pure Syrah, which is where all the color is coming from. So there's a little more, I think, you know, a little more delicateness within the spectrum of a Rhone wine.
So John, before coming to Ridge, you spent a lot of time in the Rhone, living, working there. Do you have any inspirations from your time there when you make this wine, or are you trying to make something that's uniquely Dry Creek Valley, uniquely California?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, it's difficult, you know, you know, I was definitely influenced by the places where I was doing internships and the wines I was drinking. You know, respectively from the Southern Rhone, Vieux Telegraphe, Châteauneuf-du-Pape was a huge inspiration, is to this day, in terms of a wine, you know, that's Grenache based with Syrah and Mataro in it. And then in the Northern Rhone, obviously, in Hermitage. So, you know, so yes, but I think at the same time, you know, you do have to respect the soils that you're dealing with and just how the grapes are doing within the Dry Creek setting. You know, I think we are dealing with, well, we're dealing with a warmer climate, although to be honest, you know, that's changing. I mean, it's, you know, it's getting plenty warm in Southern Rhone these days. So I think they're sort of growing together, if anything. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, Côte d'Aron is an amazing place, and it's really, for me, it's the place where Grenache just thrives the most.
Yeah, for sure. So David, working in this vineyard, what's the challenges with growing Rhone varieties at Lytton versus growing Zinfandel? Because they're growing side by side there in the vineyard. What's the different challenge?
Well, all three are, like John said, are very different. So Syrah is probably the easiest, but you have to, it likes to grow, and it's and it will grow itself right out of water. So you spend the first half of the season trying to put the brakes on it to try to slow it down, and then you spend the second half of the season putting your foot to the throttle to make sure that it keeps its leaves on, and it can get ripe really fast. Not quite as fast as Zinfandel. It gets ripe differently than Zin. So Zinfandel, the berries, they're very thin skins, and if you have a couple hot nights and some really hot days, they'll just turn to raisin very fast. Syrah doesn't do that, but it does. It reaches about 20, so it reaches just about ready to pick. So the wine term is it's like 22 bricks. So we like to pick, say, maybe 24 or 25 bricks on Syrah specifically. Well, it no longer is accumulating sugar after that, but it does start to dimple and raisins, or not raisin, but just dimple, lose water. So you really have to watch that. And it can sunburn in a heartbeat. So we have to really shade the sunny side of the vines on Syrah. Grenache, it all depends on how it sets. So it's very susceptible to, it's finicky for weather during bloom. If it sets really well, then we have to thin it. If it doesn't set well, we can't really stick fruit back on it. So then we have to watch the vigor of those vines. It's very upright vine, and it can get ripe. It can get really ripe along about the same time as Zin, but it gets there differently. It's just a nice steady plotter, a little bit like Carignan. Hot days don't bother it, but you have to watch the tannins on it. And that's why it does so well in this blend. The velvety tannins of the Syrah kind of cover the grittiness of the Grenache tannins. And then Mataro, that is a very late variety, and so we thin that every year. We thin it early, and then we just let it sit, and then yeah, right at the last minute when John's about ready to give up on harvest, we pick it. And so that's
Okay.
kind of, and it can grow pretty vigorously too. So yeah.
So John, this is the 17 vintage. To me, it's tasting great right now. It's rich through the middle. Certainly, it's got a firm casing, a structure to the wine. But what's your theory on the aging of this wine?
You know, for me, I think I think it is tasting really nice now. Some of that, you know, some of that kind of upfront fruit and fatness that comes through, especially with the Syrah, that usually you get, you know, right out of the gate. I think some of that sort of, you know, typically it kind of dies down a little bit, and you know, the wine's sort of losing its baby fat a little bit. You know, I have a hunch, you know, and we haven't, again, I haven't been making this wine that long, but what I've noticed is that they sort of go into what we, you know, commonly call sort of a dumb phase, which I don't think it is right now, but I think it's going to enter that. And then in another 3 or 4 years from now, I think that's when you're going to see a lot of the tannins start to resolve, and it'll sort of move to another level. So, you know, drink it now, hang on to it, and then come back to it.
Yeah,
In a nutshell.
yeah, no, drink it all the way along its lifeline. Really, that's the best way to do it. Yeah, no, fantastic. It is a fantastic wine. I'm really enjoying it, and my neighbors are going to enjoy it too, because I'm going to have to share some of these bottles this afternoon. But let's move to the last wine, Eric, which is the Syrah from Lytton Estate.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been making this for quite a while now. I mean, it goes back to 96 when we bought the ranch in 95. 96 was our first vintage of working with the old plantings there of Syrah Noir up on the top of the bench, basically like kind of right next to East Bench, and in a really beautiful spot, you know, Dry Creek Valley with the wind coming in, the fog. I mean, it gets some small inversion there as well. And then below, we've got some Viognier growing down kind of in the flat spots of Lytton West, where we will pick the two together, crush, co-ferment. So our very first vintage, 96, we did, it was about 10% Viognier co-fermented. I mean, we knew immediately that we were going to do what they do in the Northern Rhone Valley, which was rely on some Viognier to help kind of soften and temper the of what it did that first vintage. And 97 we continued, but unfortunately the Viognier had AXR rootstock, so David had to do a lot of replanting as those were kind of failing to phylloxera. And so there was about from 98 to about 2003 we didn't have any Viognier to work with to co-ferment, so we didn't have that special effect of Viognier really helping kind of, again, round out the tannins of Syrah. So some of those, you know, 98, 99, 2000 Syrahs were pretty structured. I mean, really spicy, really, I mean, they've aged well, but once the Viognier that David replanted came back online, then it was coming back into the blend and really helping the Syrah become a much more kind of sensuous Syrah. Now, we do ferment it more like we do Montebello. I mean, we just know it's a very tannic grape. So we open up the rollers on our destemmer. We do whole berry fermentation, small tanks. We do the pump overs as well, because Syrah, like Carignan, it tends to want to be reductive and throw a lot of the kind of that burnt matchstick, burnt rubber, you know, funk. And so, you know, in fermenting, we can really get the oxygen to the yeast and keep it nice and clean. Ferment, press off by taste. And again, pretty much the winemaking from that point is all Montebello life, where it's all about tannin management, tasting the pressed wine, deciding whether or not to add it or hold it out, because we really want to make the wine you know, well structured for ageability, but not hard edged and really aggressively tannic. And then once it's assembled, then it goes to barrel, and we'll do the same thing as we do with Montebello, which is to do a barrel malolactic fermentation, let it rest on its lee, and then after a period of time of kind of resting in those barrels, we'll rack off and clean the barrels really well, and then from there continue the aging out for about 27 months. So it's probably one of the longest barrel-aged wines that we make at Ridge. And then it's bottled, and then it gets like almost another 2 years of bottle age before it's ready to be released. And even then, it's like, you know, it still could use another decade. So it's very similar to like Petite Syrah. A lot of our older style Petite Syrahs out of York Creek, I mean, you had to be really patient with the wine. But, you know, I think with how we're treating it more like Cabernet and really finessing the tannins out, trying our best to really keep it a more approachable wine, you know, you don't have to lay it down for 15 years to be able to enjoy it, you know, and the fact that, you know, we've done a lot of the aging here, we release it, it's now, it is ready to drink, you can enjoy it. Yeah. It's just, we know it's going to get better with time. I mean, you can still pull corks on 96 with no trouble. Those are amazing wines today.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that Syrah is a noble varietal. It's got a lot of color. It's got a lot of tannin. It provides a lot for you to work with as a winemaker. And now working in the 15 vintage, a drought year. So now you've got even additional costs. So how did you deal with the 15 vintage with the Syrah?
Well, you know, we did our best to pick early. I mean, it is probably one of the riper Syrahs we've made. It's 15.3 alcohol, so it is kind of on that higher side, but the concentration was so intense. It really is such a complete wine, even though it is a riper style. You don't really feel that in the wine. There's a lot of density, incredible flavor. It's going to age really well. Now in the fermenters, we really had to be very careful about the pump over time, you know, doing much more limited pump overs as it was extracting, pressing early. And I did hold a lot of the pressed wine out because that's where a lot of the intense tannins will come from.
So how does the oak regime vary for the Syrah versus the Zinfandel or the Montebello? How is it similar and how is it different from how we handle the rest of our wines?
It's definitely different than Zinfandel. I mean, it's going to be American oak. I mean, we have loved what American oak will do with Syrah, and the fact that we do the barrel malolactics like we do with Montebello, I mean, that really has a huge impact of helping the oak integrate nicely into the wine. And it actually adds additional flavor, complexity, and texture to the wine. But it will be a higher percentage of new oak, just because as the intensity of this wine goes up over Zinfandel, it can actually incorporate a higher percentage of new oak. And again, that just adds more flavor and dimension to the wine. So, you know, we're usually looking at anywhere between 40 and 50% new oak. And the oak that I've kind of gone towards here at Montebello has been more from Appalachia. You know, it's an older forest, the trees grow slower. It just tends to produce barrels with tighter grain staves that just have more flavor and not as much kind of the coarser quality of oak. So it actually integrates nicely into the wine.
So David Gates, so the Viognier is co-fermented with the Syrah, grown right alongside the Syrah and picked at the same time. So when we're picking the Syrah, is the Viognier underripe, perfectly ripe, overripe, or how does that work when you're doing the co-fermentation? I'm giving away some secrets here.
You know, well, so the Viognier is actually, it's a separate block, and it's in a little bit richer soil, so that it doesn't grow quite as vigorously as Syrah. And we don't really care about the Viognier except that it to the Syrah. So we don't even sample it. We just, when a particular block of Syrah is ripe, we'll go and we'll pick it. We'll get a rough weigh on weight of that Syrah. And then we go in and do our best to try to get about 10% Viognier from the block. So we'll pick that Viognier block you know, 3 times usually, and each time it gets riper and riper. So it's very ripe. But again, it's not about the Viognier. It's more about the Syrah. Now, in our newest plantings of Syrah, we've done a little bit of planting of Syrah in the last 3 years, and we're mixing that 10% Viognier in the vineyard. So that way we just pick it, and I think the crews at Harvest will thank me for that, because that's just a whole extra little thing to do, and it's never fun. And usually the Syrah is in the middle of the Zinfandel harvest, so everybody's they're tired.
Well,
they don't always like the complexity, but it works out really well. And when we hit it right, I think it can be absolutely stunning. And it's like Eric was saying, it really, I think it's needed for Syrah and Dry Creek, because it's a warm place for Syrah, and so you need that little bit of that co-fermentation magic to lighten up the Syrah and increase the aromatics and help the finish.
Absolutely, it is really magical. Eric, you mentioned a descriptor, burnt rubber, with the Syrah. Where does that come from, and is that typical?
Well, it's not typical every year. It's just some years when the yeast are starting to really stress during the fermentation, they need oxygen. It's a reductive molecule, it's a sulfide, and so you're going to start to smell some of that. It is like burnt rubber, matchstick, you know, even rotten egg kind of smell coming off the top of the skins of the fermenter. And that's when you know, I mean, the yeast are starving for oxygen. So you just do an aerated pump over, and a lot of that just passes off. But certain varieties tend to do that more so than others for whatever reason. It could just be the amino acid mix of that particular grape. But like Syrah and Carignan are notorious for producing that effect. And so, you know, the type of fermentations we do with the pump overs and providing oxygen, it really helps, you know, helps the yeast get past that, and it doesn't ever show in the wine.
Okay. So we have a question also, Eric, a vintage question. This is interesting. Like comparing the 15 Syrah, which is a drought year, a warm year, versus the 2010 Lytton Estate Syrah, which was a very different vintage altogether. How would you compare the two of those?
I don't know. 10 ended up being cooler. It was, I mean, we had a 2-day heat wave. You know, we didn't suffer the loss in Syrah that we suffered with Zinfandel. So we got a full crop off of the Syrah block in 2010, and it was picked kind of later into the season. It's a really rich Syrah, but this, I think, is just a whole nother level higher, just because the stress on the vine was so intense in 15, you know, being the 4th year of the drought. In 10, we had a lot of rainfall that winter, and then we had kind of a cool summer, and then we had the 2 days of intense heat, which really didn't affect Syrah at all.
Yeah. So a very different vintage, that's for sure.
Yeah.
A very different wine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So John, you've tasted this wine right now. Somebody's asking about, can they leave this wine open overnight and have it tomorrow? And do you think it would be better tomorrow? What do you think trying this wine right now?
I'd say absolutely. You know, I mean, there's a number of wines we make. You know, Montebello being the main example, where I would say frequently they're better the second day, especially in their relative youth. You know, I mean, just that aeration, you know, really helps kind of soften the wine and really opens it up a lot. I mean, it's sort of like a very slow decanting over a 24-hour period.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would do this wine any harm at all.
No.
It would be absolutely lovely tomorrow, so that's not a worry. Good. Let's see. I think, you know, we've answered most of the questions, and we worked our way through the four wines. So I just want to take a moment to thank our panel today, who've been absolutely fabulous. Eric, David, and John, thank you for your time. Really enjoyed it. Enjoyed all the answers and all the great questions. And thank you to our audience. And thank you for joining us this Thursday evening. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you again a week from now, next Thursday, when we'll have a new flight of wines to share with you, and look forward to all your interactions and all your questions. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great evening, and enjoy these wines tonight with hopefully with some fabulous food. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Cheers.